After she married the man who promised to protect her from her lonely past, Penny Haywood raised a champagne glass at her lavish Chicago wedding and tasted something that didn't belong. What she didn't know was that her new husband, Brad Haywood, wasn't toasting their future. He was counting down to midnight when her inheritance would unlock and her life would end. But a waitress named Beth saw something that changed everything. A tiny detail on Brad's jacket cuff, a deliberate motion over Penny's glass, and a phone full of evidence that would turn the most beautiful night of Penny's life into the trap that destroyed the man who thought he could murder her in front of everyone she knew. What happened next will make you question who you trust, what revenge really looks like, and why the woman serving drinks wasn't a waitress at all. She was family Brad never knew existed. Viewers, before we dive into this story, I need you to do something. If you love stories about hidden enemies, family secrets, and the kind of justice that happens in front of witnesses, hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now let's get into this wedding, because what starts as a celebration becomes something no one in that ballroom will ever forget. The ballroom of the Ashford Grand Hotel shimmered under chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars. Each crystal fixture threw fractured light across white linen tablecloths, gold-rimmed plates, and centerpieces built from roses flown in from Ecuador that morning. Waitstaff moved through the crowd in synchronized silence, balancing trays of champagne coupes, filled with something French and expensive. Somewhere near the back of the room, a string quartet played softly, the kind of music wealthy people barely notice because it's supposed to fade into elegance. Penny Haywood stood at the center of it all, her dress a cascade of ivory silk that caught the light every time she moved. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that made her look older, more composed. Like the kind of bride who belonged in a room this expensive, she smiled at the faces around her. Colleagues from Brad's investment firm, distant relatives she'd met twice, people whose names she'd already forgotten. They smiled back, lifting glasses, murmuring congratulations. She was supposed to feel safe now, protected. Like all the instability of her childhood, all the years under her rigid guardian's cold supervision had finally led somewhere warm. Brad stood beside her, his hand resting at the small of her back. He was the kind of handsome that photographs well, sharp jaw, controlled smile, posture that looked natural but never relaxed. When he spoke, his voice carried just enough warmth to seem genuine. When he touched her, his fingers lingered just long enough to suggest affection. Everything about Brad Haywood felt practiced, rehearsed, like a performance he'd perfected over years. But it was working. Penny believed him. Across the room, moving between tables with a silver tray balanced on one hand, a woman named Beth moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd worked 1,000 events exactly like this one. Her uniform was standard: black vest, white shirt, hair pulled back, but something about her didn't quite fit. Her shoes were wrong, too sturdy for catering work. Her posture was too alert, scanning corners like she was counting exits instead of dirty plates. When she set down glasses, her eyes never stopped moving, watching, calculating, waiting. No one noticed her. Waitstaff are furniture in rooms like this. Brad raised his glass, the crystal catching light as he turned toward Penny. His smile widened, the kind that makes people in photographs look happy. The room quieted. Cameras turned. The videographer adjusted his angle. "To my beautiful wife," Brad said, his voice carrying across white tablecloths and designer floral arrangements, "to the beginning of forever." Penny lifted her champagne coupe, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders like a veil. This was it. The life she'd been promised. The safety she'd been chasing since childhood. She brought the glass to her lips and tasted something wrong. It wasn't subtle. It was sharp, chemical, a bitterness that didn't belong in something expensive. Her throat tightened. Her eyes watered. She lowered the glass quickly, covering her mouth with her free hand, as if emotion had overwhelmed her. Around her, guests smiled knowingly, the bride overcome with joy. How sweet. But Brad's face told a different story. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was watching. His gaze flicked from Penny's face to the glass in her hand, then back again, like he was checking a timer, like he was waiting for something specific to happen. His expression was careful, controlled, but underneath it was something else. Anticipation. The way a hunter watches prey stumble. Beth saw it. She was standing 3 tables away, ostensibly clearing used plates, but her attention had been locked on Brad Haywood since the moment the champagne was poured. She'd been watching him all night. The way he never touched the bottle. The way his hand had hovered over Penny's glass for just a second before he pulled it away. And now she saw what everyone else missed. Brad's left hand, the one not holding his own glass, moved slightly. His thumb pressed against the rim of Penny's champagne coupe for half a second, then pulled away. Casual. Innocent. Except it wasn't. Beth had seen that motion before. Years ago. On a different man. In a different room. With a different woman who never got the chance to realize what had been done to her. Beth's hand moved to the phone tucked in her apron pocket. She didn't pull it out. Didn't make a scene. She just angled the screen toward Penny, just enough, and let the paused video frame speak for itself. Brad's thumb on the rim. The motion captured clean. Penny's eyes flicked sideways. Not to Brad. Not to the concerned faces of wedding guests leaning forward to see if the bride was all right. To Beth's phone. To the image frozen there. And in that single moment, Penny Haywood understood 3 things. She had married a man who was trying to kill her. She was supposed to die tonight. And the waitress who just showed her the truth wasn't a waitress at all. Penny's hand began to shake. Not from whatever Brad had put in her drink, but from the sudden, crushing weight of realization. She kept her other hand over her mouth, kept her eyes wet with tears that looked like overwhelming joy. She played the part Brad expected. The grateful bride. The emotional wife. The perfect victim. But inside something shifted. Something cold and calculating and absolutely furious. Because Penny Haywood had spent her entire life being underestimated, being controlled, being told she needed protection, and she had just discovered that the man who promised to keep her safe was the one she needed protection from. The string quartet continued playing. Guests raised their glasses in cheerful toasts. The videographer captured every moment in high definition. And across the ballroom, Beth's phone kept recording. Because this wasn't just a wedding anymore. This was evidence. But to understand how a wedding turned into a trap, how a waitress became a hunter, and how Brad Haywood walked into a ballroom thinking he'd planned the perfect murder, you have to go back 3 months. Back to when Brad first found Penny. Back to when he learned about an inheritance structured with a clause designed to catch predators exactly like him. Back to when Beth discovered the connections between her mother's death and the Haywood family fortune. Back to when 2 women's paths began converging toward this single, devastating night. Because this story didn't start with champagne and chandeliers. It started with a man who made a career out of finding wealthy, lonely women, and two sisters who didn't know they were sisters yet. Beth had worked enough weddings to know the difference between an accident and an execution. Accidents were messy, loud, apologetic. What Brad Haywood just did was careful, deliberate, timed to the second. Beth moved between tables, her tray balanced with practiced ease, but her mind cataloged everything she'd observed. Brad never touched the champagne bottle when it arrived. The sommelier poured while Brad smiled, his hands nowhere near the glasses. When guests stood for the toast, Brad lifted his coupe with his right hand. Clean, innocent. His left hand did something else entirely. It hovered over Penny's glass for less than 2 seconds. His thumb pressed the rim with practiced precision, then pulled away. The motion was so subtle the videographer 6 feet away missed it completely. Beth didn't. She'd been watching Brad Haywood like a hawk watches a snake, and she'd seen the evidence clinging to his jacket. A tiny strip of clear film caught inside his cuff, the kind used to seal powdered supplements in individual doses, the kind you tear open and pour into drinks. Beth had seen it in wellness clubs, gym locker rooms, places where people mixed protein shakes. In a champagne glass at a wedding, it meant something darker. Brad wasn't using crude poison. He was using something designed to mimic a medical crisis. Panic, shortness of breath, seizure-like tremors. The kind of collapse that summons ambulances, not detectives. The kind of tragedy that makes widowers sympathetic before midnight strikes. Beth glanced at the clock above the ballroom entrance. 10:43 p.m., less than 2 hours until midnight. Whatever Brad's plan required, it needed Penny alive until then. But not much longer. She adjusted the name badge clipped to her vest. Beth Davis, in plain black lettering, issued by Prestige Event Staffing 3 weeks ago under a name that wasn't hers. The background check had been minimal. Her fake references held. Getting hired was easy. Getting assigned to this specific wedding took more effort. Careful scheduling requests, mentions of high-end experience, willingness to work late Saturday nights when most servers wanted off. Beth had made herself indispensable because she needed to be here tonight, not to serve champagne. She needed to watch Brad Haywood make his move, 3 years after her mother's sudden death at a charity gala. 3 years since the coroner ruled it a heart attack, despite clean medical history. 3 years of digging, finding connections to a man who married women with quiet money. Women who died unexpectedly. Women whose estates benefited their recent husbands. Women like Penny. Beth could have gone to the police. She had evidence, financial records, pattern analysis, timelines that didn't align. But evidence wasn't proof. Not the kind that convicted charming men with expensive lawyers. She needed him caught in the act, on camera, with witnesses who couldn't be bought. So she'd infiltrated his wedding. Across the ballroom, movement caught her attention. The best man, thick-necked, expensive suit, spoke quietly to 2 ushers near the entrance. Beth knew his name from the program in her apron. Coulter Wynn, investment partner. He gestured toward the side exits. The ushers nodded, positioning themselves casually but deliberately in front of the doors. Beth's jaw tightened. They were controlling the room. No locked doors, no visible barriers, just bodies placed strategically to manage flow. To ensure that if Penny started choking, collapsing, crying for help, no one would rush out too quickly. No one would interfere before Brad's plan finished. This wasn't improvised. This was coordinated. Beth's hand moved to the phone in her apron. She'd been recording since the toast began. Now she had what she needed: the thumb on the rim, the film on his cuff, the timing too perfect. She could leave now. Send the footage to authorities. Let the system handle Brad Haywood. But systems failed women like Penny, like her mother. They ruled murders accidents, believed charming men with clean records. So Beth made a choice. She angled her phone screen toward Penny, just enough to show the paused video frame if the bride looked in the right direction. Brad's thumb. The rim. Undeniable truth frozen in high definition. Beth didn't know if Penny would look, didn't know if the woman was alert enough, aware enough, suspicious enough to glance away from her husband's face and notice a waitress holding evidence. But she had to try. Because if Penny saw what Beth was showing her, everything changed. The victim became a witness. The wedding became a crime scene. And Brad Haywood's perfect plan would collapse before he realized someone was watching. Penny's hand trembled over her mouth, tears streaming in a way that looked like overwhelming emotion. Guests murmured sympathetically. Brad stepped closer, concerned, reaching for her elbow like a devoted husband steadying his bride. But Penny's eyes moved, not to Brad, not to the concerned guests, to Beth's phone, to the image frozen there. And Beth saw the exact moment Penny Haywood understood what her husband had done. Penny's throat burned. Not champagne burn. This was chemical, sharp, wrong. Her hand trembled as she lowered the glass. Her other hand pressed against her mouth. Let them think it was emotion. Let Brad think that. The image on the waitress's phone told Penny everything she needed to know about the man she'd just married. Brad's thumb on the rim of her glass. Deliberate, precise, captured from an angle no guest would notice. Penny forced herself to breathe slowly, controlled. Panic would draw attention. She needed to appear overwhelmed, the bride everyone expected. Not the woman who'd just discovered her husband was trying to kill her. Her vision blurred with tears that were real now. Not from whatever he'd put in her drink, but from the crushing weight of understanding. She'd married a stranger. Worse, she'd married a predator who'd spent months convincing her she was safe. Across the ballroom, the waitress, Beth, according to the name badge, moved closer under the pretense of collecting empty glasses. Her eyes met Penny's for half a second. No sympathy, no panic, just steady, deliberate focus. Penny's mind raced through the past 6 months. Brad proposing after 3 months. His insistence on a December wedding. Why wait when we're so sure? The paperwork obsession. Estate planning, he'd called it. Documents she barely read. His explanations smooth. Trusts. Beneficiaries. Release clauses tied to marital status. Midnight mattered because that's when the final documents took effect. The ones transferring control of her mother's estate. Quiet wealth, Brad had carefully explained. Substantial enough to make marriage worth planning. Worth killing for. Penny's stomach twisted. She'd been so lonely after her guardian passed. Brad had sensed that vulnerability. He'd offered exactly what she needed: stability, affection, family, and she'd walked into his trap. Beth moved past the head table, her tray balanced carefully. As she leaned to collect a champagne flute, she angled close enough for Penny to hear her whisper, barely audible over the string quartet. Don't go alone with him. Swap the glasses. 4 words. Penny understood instantly. Whatever was in her drink, fast acting, designed to mimic medical crisis, timed to make Brad a widower by midnight, could work just as well on him. Beth wasn't telling her to run. She was telling her to reverse the trap. Penny's hand shook harder, her breathing growing ragged in a way that looked like panic. Guests leaned forward, concern rippling through the tables closest to the bridal party. Brad stepped toward her, his expression perfectly calibrated between worry and reassurance. "Darling, are you all right?" His voice carried just enough volume for nearby tables to hear. The devoted husband, the protective partner. Penny nodded, gasping, letting her legs buckle enough to steady herself against the table. Her hand, holding the champagne coupe, wavered near Brad's glass. Confusion made the motion look accidental. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's so overwhelming." Brad smiled, reaching for her elbow. In that moment, his attention on her face, on maintaining his performance, Penny switched the glasses. A subtle shift, the trembling covering deliberate placement. Brad's glass moved left. Hers moved right. The crystal caught light identically. No one noticed. Brad guided her gently toward her chair, his hand supportive at her back. "Sit down, sweetheart. Take a breath. You've had a long day." Penny sat, her eyes downcast, playing the role of overwhelmed bride perfectly. Around them, guests murmured understanding. The string quartet continued playing. The videographer adjusted his angle to capture the tender moment. Husband caring for his emotional wife. Beth had moved to the far side of the ballroom, but Penny could feel her watching, waiting. Brad straightened, addressing the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed everything was going according to plan. "Thank you all for your patience. My beautiful bride is just a little overcome with emotion. It's been quite a night." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Affectionate. Knowing. Brad reached for his glass. Except it wasn't his glass anymore. It was Penny's. The one he'd poisoned. The one meant to make her collapse in front of witnesses while he played the devastated husband calling for help. He lifted it toward the crowd in a gesture of reassurance. "To love," he said, his smile confident. "To the future we're building together." And he drank. Penny watched him swallow, watched the champagne slide down his throat, watched him lower the glass with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just secured his victory. He had no idea. For the first time since seeing Beth's phone, Penny felt something other than fear. She felt power. Because Brad Haywood had just consumed whatever he'd intended for her. And in less than 5 minutes, maybe less, he was going to realize that the woman he'd tried to murder was smarter than he'd ever given her credit for. Beth caught Penny's eye from across the ballroom, and Penny, still playing the fragile bride, allowed herself the smallest, coldest smile. Brad Haywood felt invincible. The champagne had gone down smooth, the crowd was smiling, and his wife sat pale and trembling, exactly as planned. In less than 90 minutes, he'd be a widower with access to holdings most people didn't know existed. He turned back to the crowd. "My bride just needs a moment. You know how emotional weddings can be." Laughter rippled through the tables. Someone clinked their glass. Brad leaned down, pressing his lips to Penny's forehead in a gesture that looked tender. She didn't pull away, just sat with her hands folded, eyes downcast. Perfect. Brad straightened, addressing the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight." The applause was warm. He took another sip of champagne. That's when he felt it. Tightness in his chest. Subtle at first, like heartburn. Brad frowned, pressing his hand against his sternum. Probably nerves. but the tightness spread. His throat constricted. His pulse accelerated. Not anxiety, something chemical. Brad set down his glass, trying to maintain composure. Brad's vision blurred. He gripped the chair for balance. Across the table, Penny watched him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, focused. She knew. The glass switch, the trembling that had looked like panic. She'd switched them. Brad's jaw clenched. Irritation flashed hot, followed by fear. Whatever he'd put in her drink was now working through his system. Fast acting, designed to mimic medical crisis. He tried to call for Coulter, but his throat felt thick. His breathing came shorter. Sweat broke along his hairline. His phone slipped from his grip, clattering onto the table. Nearby guests turned, concern replacing polite interest. "Brad!" someone called. Coulter Wynn appeared at Brad's side, gripping his shoulder. "You need to sit down." Brad shook his head, but his legs felt unsteady. Coulter steered him toward the side exit. "Just need some air," Coulter announced. "Too much excitement." Uncertain laughter. "What happened?" Coulter whispered harshly. "The glass," Brad managed. "She switched. Stop." Every head turned. The waitress stood in the center of the room. She'd set down her tray. Her posture had changed completely, no longer deferential, no longer invisible. She pulled her phone from her apron, holding it up, screen facing outward. "My name isn't Beth Davis," she said, voice steady and cold. "And before you help him leave, you should see what he did." She pressed play. The screen showed Brad's hand hovering over Penny's glass, his thumb pressing the rim. The timestamp read 10:37 p.m. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Beth swiped to another clip, Coulter slipping something into Brad's jacket pocket earlier. Quick, practiced. "Brad Haywood poisoned his wife's drink," Beth said. "He planned for her to collapse during the toast. A tragic emergency. A devastated widower. Except she saw what I saw, and she gave him exactly what he tried to give her." Brad's legs buckled. Coulter caught him, face pale. Wedding guests stood frozen, phones pointed at the head table. The videographer's camera still rolled. "This isn't the first time," Beth continued, eyes locked on Brad. 3 years ago, Brad tried this on another woman at a charity gala in Boston. The coroner ruled it a heart attack." She stepped forward. "That woman was my mother." The ballroom erupted, shocked exclamations, gasps, chairs scraping. But beneath it all came a sound that made everything stop. The string quartet faltered. One violin held a note too long. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Brad sagged in Coulter's grip, breathing ragged, face slick with sweat. And across the ballroom, Penny Haywood stood from her chair. She didn't rush to his side, didn't cry for help. She simply stood there, watching her husband collapse, her face expressionless. The music had died mid-note. The wedding was over, and the reckoning had just begun. Beth pulled an envelope from her pocket. Cream-colored, expensive stationery, the kind used for legal declarations. "My mother's name was Lydia Kent," Beth said. 3 years ago, she met a charming investment consultant named Brad Haywood at a charity gala. 6 months later, she was dead. "Heart attack," the coroner said. "Convenient." Brad's face had gone gray. He sagged against Coulter, breathing shallow, eyes locked on Beth with rage and terror. "I spent 3 years following the money, the patterns, the quiet deaths of women with private wealth. Women whose estates benefited their recent husbands. She held up the envelope. 6 months ago, I found out why my mother's death mattered to Penny Haywood. Penny stood motionless, face pale but composed. Guests whispered frantically, phones recording. Beth opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet. This is a sealed letter from Naomi Haywood, Penny's mother, held in a safety deposit box, to be opened only in the event of Penny's marriage or death. She looked at Penny. Your mother had another daughter, a child she gave up for adoption at 17, a daughter she never publicly claimed, but never stopped protecting. Penny's hand gripped her chair, knuckles white. That daughter is me, Beth said quietly. I'm your half-sister, and your mother knew someone would eventually come for you, for the wealth she'd structured to protect us both. So she set a trap. Beth's voice hardened. The inheritance clause wasn't protection. It was bait, designed to draw out whoever was hunting our family's money. She turned to Brad. You didn't stumble onto Penny. You found her by researching women connected to quiet estates, private trusts, the kind of wealth predators spend years learning to identify. Beth pulled up a file on her phone. I have financial records going back 8 years. 4 women, 4 sudden deaths, 4 estates that transferred to men who'd entered their lives within a year. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother was one of them, Beth said. Brad was patient, charming, attentive. 6 months later, she collapsed during a fundraising dinner. No one questioned it. Beth's jaw clenched. But I questioned everything. When I found the connection between my mother and Penny's mother, when I discovered we were sisters, I understood. Brad wasn't hunting individual women. He was hunting a family. Generational wealth hidden across multiple trusts. She looked at Penny. Your mother's inheritance releases control when you marry and sign specific documents. But there's a second clause. If you die within 12 months of marriage, everything reverts to a contingency trust Brad couldn't touch. Penny's eyes widened. So he needed you alive long enough to sign, Beth said, but dead before you understood what you'd signed away. A window of maybe 30 minutes. Brad tried to speak, managed only a strangled sound. Beth's expression turned cold, but his real plan wasn't just killing you. It was framing me. Silence pressed down like weight. Brad knew I'd been investigating him, Beth said. He knew I'd gotten hired through the staffing agency, so he used it. My fingerprints on glasses, trays, napkins. The anonymous waitress who poisoned the bride. Easy to convict. She stepped closer. Except I saw the film on his cuff. I recorded him tampering with the glass, and I showed Penny the truth. Beth's phone buzzed. She held it up so guests could see. Text message. Sent to Brad at 11:52 p.m. She read aloud. Deposit confirmed. Wire will complete at midnight. After 12:30 a.m. clause reverses. She becomes worthless. The ballroom erupted. Coulter's phone lit up in his pocket, screen visible through fabric. He pulled it out, froze seeing the same message. Beth smiled grimly. That's right. Coulter wasn't just the best man. He was the insurance. The witness who'd testify to Penny's tragic collapse. The friend who'd help Brad navigate his grief. The partner who'd get a cut of the estate for his trouble. Coulter's face went white. Brad's legs gave out completely. He collapsed onto the floor, Coulter releasing him in shock. Around them, guests backed away, creating a circle of empty space. The videographer kept filming. Someone had already called 911. And in the center of it all, Penny Haywood walked slowly toward where her husband lay, gasping on the polished ballroom floor. She looked down at him, at the man who'd promised to love her, to protect her, to build a future with her. The man who'd planned to murder her in front of everyone she knew. Brad's eyes found hers, desperate, pleading. And Penny smiled. Not warm, not forgiving. Cold. Satisfied. Absolutely certain. The smile of a woman who'd just discovered she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever believed. The clock on the ballroom wall read 11:58 p.m. Sirens wailed in the distance. Wedding guests clustered in groups, phones out, voices hushed. The videographer's camera continued rolling. The collapsed groom, the stunned best man, the bride standing motionless. The wedding coordinator approached cautiously, holding a black leather folder. "Mrs. Haywood, I'm sorry for the timing, but the midnight documents need signing. Your husband insisted they be ready at exactly midnight," Penny finished quietly. "Yes, he was very specific." The coordinator hesitated, glancing at Brad's crumpled form. "Perhaps we should wait." "No, give them to me." The coordinator handed over the folder and backed away. Penny opened it. Inside were 3 documents flagged with signature tabs. Estate transfer authorizations, beneficiary designations, trust releases, the paperwork that would shift control of her mother's holdings to her new husband minutes after midnight. The trap Brad had engineered. She looked down at where he lay, gasping, eyes wild with pain and fear. Coulter had stepped back, hands raised. Around them, guests watched in horrified fascination. Every phone was recording. Penny felt their attention like weight. She smiled, not the trembling smile of a new wife, but the cold, certain smile of someone who'd discovered exactly how much power she had. She walked back to the head table, dress whispering against the floor. She set the folder down on the white linen, positioning it between the roses and abandoned champagne glasses. Beth moved closer, standing just within Penny's vision. Silent. Watchful. Penny picked up the first document and held it up. "Brad wanted me to sign these at midnight," she said, voice carrying across the ballroom. "He said it was important, time-sensitive, part of estate planning that would protect us both." "He was very insistent about midnight," Penny continued. "Do you know why? Because that's when the inheritance clause activates. That's when you were supposed to have poisoned me successfully." Brad tried to speak, managed only a choked sound. "You needed me alive long enough to sign," she said, "and dead shortly after. A window where the documents would be valid, but I'd be too incapacitated to revoke them." She examined the document. "My mother was smarter than both of us. She structured this inheritance to expose whoever tried to exploit me. The midnight deadline, the marriage requirement, the reversion clause." Penny looked at Beth, then back at the folder. "She gave me a test, and you failed it." The clock struck midnight. 12 chimes, slow and deliberate. As the final bell faded, Penny tore the first document in half. The sound was sharp, decisive. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Penny tore it again and again, until the authorization was confetti in her hands. She let the pieces fall onto the tablecloth. Then she picked up the second document. "No," Brad croaked. "You can't." "I can," Penny said calmly. "I'm legally married. It's past midnight. These documents are valid, which means I have every right to destroy them." She tore the beneficiary designation slowly, deliberately. Brad tried to push himself up, but his arms gave out. Penny picked up the final document. You tried to kill me in front of everyone I know, she said steadily. You married me intending to murder me before our first anniversary. You targeted my family's wealth the same way you targeted Beth's mother. She held the document up. You thought I was weak, isolated, easy to manipulate. She tore the paper in half. You were wrong. The pieces joined the others. Outside, sirens screamed to a halt. Paramedics rushed in, directed to Brad on the floor. But they weren't saving a grieving husband. They were responding to a poisoning, a crime. A police officer followed them in, scanning the scene. What happened here? Beth stepped forward, phone in hand. Officer, I have video evidence of attempted murder. While Beth played the footage, Penny watched paramedics load Brad onto a stretcher. His eyes found hers, desperate, pleading. She looked back without emotion. Beth moved to stand beside her. Not touching, just present. Two women connected by blood and betrayal. He'll survive, Beth said quietly. The dose wasn't meant to kill immediately. Long enough for me to sign, Penny finished. Which you didn't. No, I didn't. Brad was wheeled toward the exit, police officers flanking the stretcher. Coulter was already in handcuffs. Brad survived the night. But as the ballroom doors closed, Penny knew he'd lost everything else. His plan, his freedom, his reputation. And the two women he'd tried to destroy stood together, unbroken, as his perfect crime collapsed around him. 3 weeks later, Penny sat in a conference room at First National Bank, watching her mother's attorney lay out documents that finally made sense. Your mother knew exactly who was coming, the attorney explained. She'd been tracking Brad Haywood for 2 years. After Lydia Kent's death, she hired investigators. She found Brad's pattern. 4 women, 4 deaths, 4 estates. Beth sat beside Penny. In 3 weeks, they'd gone from strangers to sisters, survivors. She structured the midnight clause to force Brad to show his hand, the attorney continued. The timing was designed to expose him. A trap, Penny said quietly. And it worked. Outside the windows, Chicago stretched under gray December skies. Inside, the truth finally settled. The investigation moved fast. Beth's footage became airtight evidence. The powder residue in Brad's jacket matched the substance in Penny's glass. Traces in Brad's system confirmed he'd consumed it himself. Coulter flipped within 48 hours, providing testimony about Brad's previous targets. The pattern went back 7 women, 7 deaths, 7 estates. Brad's entire empire was collapsing. The inheritance reverts to full control once the marriage is annulled, the attorney said. The court has issued a preliminary injunction preventing Brad from accessing any marital assets, and your mother amended the trust 6 months before her death, naming both daughters as equal beneficiaries. She left letters for each of you. The attorney slid 2 sealed envelopes across the table. Penny stared at the cream-colored paper, her mother's handwriting elegant. For Penny, when you're ready. Beth picked up her envelope, fingers trembling. She wrote to me? She wanted you to know she never stopped thinking about you. Beth pressed the envelope against her chest, eyes wet. Penny took her sister's hand, squeezed. They sat in silence while the attorney left them alone. I almost married him, Penny said eventually. I almost signed those papers. But you didn't. Because you were watching. Beth's jaw tightened. I spent 3 years wanting revenge. I thought catching Brad would feel triumphant. And? It feels empty. She's still gone. Brad's going to prison, but it doesn't bring them back. Penny understood. Justice and healing aren't the same thing. "We're alive," Penny said quietly. "We found each other. Maybe that's what they wanted." Beth looked at her sister, the family she'd gained by nearly losing everything. "Yeah, maybe it is." Later that night, the wedding videographer delivered the final footage to police as evidence. But before he did, he watched the last 5 minutes one more time. The frame showed Penny and Beth standing side by side in the ballroom's wreckage. Torn documents scattered across white linen, abandoned champagne glasses, empty chairs where guests had fled. The two women weren't smiling, weren't crying, just standing there, backlit by chandeliers, surrounded by the ruins of Brad Haywood's perfect plan. The videographer had filmed thousands of weddings. He'd captured joy, tears, chaos, drama, but he'd never seen anything like this. Two women who'd walked into a ballroom as strangers, one a bride, one a server, and walked out as sisters who'd survived an execution. The news coverage lasted weeks. Headlines screamed about the wedding poisoning, the predator exposed. Brad Haywood's face became synonymous with betrayal. But the image that stuck, shared across every platform, dissected by every true crime podcast, frozen as evidence in courtrooms, was the final frame of that wedding video. Penny and Beth, standing unbroken, not victims, not anymore. Survivors who'd rewritten the ending of a story designed to destroy them. Brad Haywood had planned an execution disguised as a wedding. He'd chosen the wrong women. Because Penny and Beth didn't just survive the night. They survived each other's absence for 30 years. They survived their mother's careful silence. They survived loneliness, manipulation, calculated cruelty. And when Brad Haywood tried to make them victims, they became something far more dangerous. They became family. The wedding video froze on that final image. Penny and Beth, side by side, unsmiling, unbroken. This wasn't a wedding. It was a failed execution, and the women walked out alive.